clear up one or two points that might not be very clear. First of all, it was asked that I perhaps mention more books as I go along. That sometimes takes up more time than I like to do, but I'll try to mention more. If you want to read just one book on the military aspects of the war that I think is a very balanced account, it's not really pro or con. I'm not sure how to spell the man's last name, Don Higginbotham. I think this is pretty close. I think I'll leave the title of it as The War for American Independence, something like that. It's Indiana University Press book. A very good, recent, excellently written scholarly overview of the military features of the war. Higginbotham I like because he discusses this militia versus professional army controversy. He discusses Washington's failures as a military strategist and so on and so forth. Another thing I should mention is this issue of guerrilla warfare, which we touched upon. And those of you familiar with Murray Rothbard's Conceived in Liberty, and by the way, I highly recommend, if you can find that 4-volume set, by all means do buy it. It gives you a libertarian perspective on the economic issues, on the political issues, a very well-written, very well-researched series of books. I mentioned I had my disagreements with it, and let me mention what one of those is, or at least one of my, something I'm not quite so certain of as Professor Rothbard seems to be. Rothbard suggests that had the Americans stayed with a purely guerrilla style of warfare, had they not organized a professional army but rather used guerrilla tactics, that it was highly likely that the problem of the war debt, the problem of the centralizing tendency of government after the war, all these problems of finance, etc., could have been avoided. Now, that's possibly true. And I'm not saying that a guerrilla-style war would not have perhaps worked equally well in the end against the English. I don't know, and I don't think anyone does, but possibly it could have worked. But now here's what you have to consider, and this is what I think Professor Rothbard tends to overlook. Have you ever heard of a fellow named William T. Sherman during the Civil War? I'll be getting to him later, a little later on. He believed, as he put it, that we're fighting. He was a Northern general in the Civil War who did his famous march down to Georgia, then his famous march to the sea, cutting a 50-mile swath of the countryside as he went with thousands of soldiers, killing livestock, destroying property, burning homes, everything. The point Sherman made was, he said, look, we're fighting not just the rebel army, we're fighting the rebel people. And this is a guerrilla-style war, he said. We have to fight the people. The people are supporting this army, and if you're going to fight guerrillas, then you just don't kill armed combatants. You go out and you destroy the source of their supply, the base of their support. You destroy the livestock, the grain, everything you can get your hands on. It's fine and dandy to talk about a guerrilla-style war, but what did the United States do in Vietnam to try to fight guerrillas? They burned entire villages. They used napalm. When you can't distinguish the enemy from the friends, you tend to kill everyone. And there's reason for that. If you're dealing with non-uniformed combatants, you can't distinguish soldiers from civilians. And I'm just saying that when we talk about the glories of guerrilla warfare, how great it would have been, what would the British have done in response to that? That's the key question here. We can't just say, well, gee, if we would have fought a guerrilla war, it would have been a lot better. What did the Americans themselves do with the American Indians who fought guerrilla-style war? We wiped out entire villages. We didn't distinguish between combatants and non-combatants, and all of them looked alike to us. So when you get into this guerrilla war controversy, if you're interested in this period of American history, keep in mind what it forces the other side to do militarily. It's one thing to talk about guerrilla war. It's another thing to realize how it limits the options, so to speak, of the other side. I'm sure that had Americans stayed with a purely guerrilla war tactic, the British would have retaliated in a far more severe manner than they did. And some of the retaliation was pretty severe as it was. The other thing that just came up briefly was this issue of the Hessians. Who were they? Why were they used? The Hessians were recruited. The British fought a lot of their wars. A lot of these imperial or dynastic powers in the 18th century did not use their own soldiers. They hired mercenaries from other countries. Originally, George III got what he thought was an agreement from the Russian Empress to use Russian soldiers, and that she backed out of it. But he was able to get the Hessians from a certain part of Germany. And the problem with the Hessians, and I'm bringing this up because it had something to do with the change of the attitude of even loyalists in America. To use Hessians against Americans was considered something just awful because the Hessians were extremely feared. They came over here to get booty. Part of the Hessian ethic of warfare, so to speak, was you could take what you could carry. And when the Hessians would go in somewhere and were part of a victorious military victory, the British Army oftentimes had to restrain them from just carrying everything off they could. The problem is they wanted to steal from everyone in many cases. You know, the loyalists, Americans to them all looked alike. So the loyalists got a little peeved as well. It's probably the case that the British lost some loyalist support, or some neutral support, because they used the Hessians. The Hessians were like, and there's reports of when the first Hessian soldiers would be seen by Americans. They're extremely feared. They looked very military, and they had this great uniform and the saber and all that. And it was a rather frightening experience to be hunted down by a Hessian. There are cases of battles, these skirmishes going on where the Hessians are chasing the colonials into the woods. The guy would trip over a log, and the Hessian would just bayonet him. They didn't have the quite ethics of warfare that some of the British did. They weren't schooled, let us say, in that idea of civilized warfare. Okay, with that, let's move on. I want to talk a little bit about the ratification of the Constitution. Now, I can't spend as much time on this as it deserves. It's an extremely important, but at the same time, an extremely complex issue. I can't really, and I wish I could, I can't really say that those who were in favor of the Constitution were the bad guys and the anti-federalists, so-called, those who opposed the Constitution were the good guys. Some guys opposed the Constitution were kind of jerks. Some guys who favored it were jerks. So it's a complex issue, but there's important philosophical issues involved. You have to understand, first of all, that the Articles of Confederation required all 13 colonies to unanimously consent to any amendment or change in the Articles of Confederation. Now, the Articles of Confederation were, in effect, the pre-Constitution Constitution in America. They were kind of what ruled the central or the federal government. But they did not, as I said before, give the central government the power to tax. Now, how are you going to run a respectable federal government if you can't make people give you money? How are you going to do that? The Hamiltonians, the big government people, that quote from Nathaniel Ames where he referred to the phrase energetic government, these were the energetic government people. The Hamiltonians. Alexander Hamilton was a firm believer, and I'll be getting into this controversy in a second. He was one of the great evil geniuses of early American history. He and Jefferson had a lifelong bitter dispute, and the Hamilton versus Jefferson paradigm, so to speak, the models, continue throughout American history. This is one thing I'm going to develop as I go along. How Jefferson is viewed at one period in American history and how Hamilton is viewed. The great admirers of Alexander Hamilton include people like Theodore Roosevelt, hated Jefferson, loved Hamilton. The great admirers of Jefferson included people like Jackson, Andrew Jackson, who was elected in 1828, and hated Hamilton. I'll be going into that in a moment. But Alexander Hamilton, among others, wanted a strong central government. They wanted a government with very broad constitutional powers. The so-called welfare clause, general welfare clause in the United States Constitution, which has been so loosely interpreted that there's really no restrictions on what the federal government can do, that was not put in there accidentally. These people wanted this welfare clause put in. They wanted very broad-based powers to be given to the central government. They have various reasons for this. It's not just a matter of personal power. They had a certain theory of government. Now, the people like Alexander Hamilton were explicitly admirers of the British system, as they called it. They believed the British Constitution, and I'll explain what was meant here by British Constitution, they believed that the British Constitution had preserved the liberties of England for many centuries. So I'm not attributing to them per se evil motives, in the sense that I think they did value liberty to a certain extent. But they admired the British system. Now, what was the British system? The British system, or the so-called British Constitution, referred to the structure of the British government. That is to say, its division of powers into the King, the House of Lords, and the House of Commons. Now, there was a checks and balance, balance and separation of powers checking each other in this theory of the British Constitution. This was popularized all throughout the writing about the British Constitution. Many Americans accepted it. The United States Constitution was modeled, in that sense, after the British Constitution. Now, remember, a constitution here doesn't mean written document. It means structure. But the written United States Constitution was based on the British model. And most of those people who were for it, like Hamilton, the really strong proponents of it, admired the British system. Other lukewarm supporters of the Constitution, like Jefferson, did not admire the British system. The British system was to play a very important role in Hamilton's later policies. I'll be returning to this in a moment. But his pushing through a Bank of the United States, that was explicitly modeled on the Bank of England. His stressing of the position of Secretary of the Treasury was based on the role that the First Lord of the Treasury had in England, in other words, known as the Prime Minister. Many of these things about Hamilton, what he did, become understandable only if you understand the British system and how Hamilton tried to adapt the British system to America. But now, what were the motives behind the establishment of the U.S. Constitution? The story you get over and over again is that the Articles of Confederation were what? They were weak. How many of you have heard that? They were weak. Well, weak in what sense? Well, one sense was they could not tax. They did not permit taxation. Now, you can't get much of a, as I said, much of a centralized power going without the authority to tax. These people believed in a strong central government. So the Constitution, there are a couple of different conventions. It gets rather complicated, but the Philadelphia Convention draws up the Constitution. These people, there was opposition by many of the old radicals. Remember Richard Henry Lee, the fellow who first proposed from the Virginia legislature, the delegate who proposed American independence? He was an anti-federalist. He virulently opposed the Constitution. Many of the old-time Virginians did. People like George Mason, one of the great Virginian radicals, opposed the Constitution. Sam Adams was opposed to it initially. Thomas Jefferson opposed it initially. Some of these people, as I said, were won over by the inclusion of a Bill of Rights, feeling that, well, this was a compromise, but at least it would tend to check what powers the Constitution was giving to the federal government. To put it very simply, in the eyes of these anti-federalists, by the way, Patrick Henry was another famous opponent of the Constitution. Did you ever hear the phrase, "I smelt a rat"? That comes from his speech against the United States Constitution in the Virginia legislature. These old revolutionaries, these people who had been involved in the Declaration of Independence, in the Revolutionary War, these old revolutionaries looked upon the Constitution, without the Bill of Rights now, as primarily a counter-revolutionary document. What they saw it as was a document which more or less turned back the clock and destroyed the principles of 76, as they like to call them. There's a number of, it's a very interesting argument. Fortunately, there's some very good material on this. Herbert J. Storing, who's now deceased, published in about 5 or 6 volumes a very extensive collection called the Anti-Federalist Papers, which you should read. Fortunately, it's a 1-volume edited version out now in paperback, which you can pick up for about $10, with very good introductions by Storing, and he reprints the most important of the Anti-Federalists. And by Anti-Federalist here, I mean opposed to the Constitution. He reprints the most important of the Anti-Federalist Papers. Very prominent intellectuals in America were very strongly opposed to the Constitution. Now, scholars have debated a lot about who supported the Constitution and why, and who opposed it. It's estimated, and this is just a rough guess, there's no way to tell for sure, it's estimated that at least 50% of the population probably opposed ratification of the Constitution. The Constitution was supported primarily in the commercial centers, in the big cities. It got support in New York, in Philadelphia. The commercial interests, as they were called, tended to be strong supporters of the Constitution because they saw certain advantages to be derived from its adoption. The opponents of the Constitution tended to be, and this has been fairly well documented, what we might call the backwoods people. The farmers, the small yeoman farmers in the Jeffersonian lore, the man who owns his own tract of land and plows it with his own hands. These people were very suspicious of the so-called commercial interests, the people backing the Constitution. Now, what this meant is that if the Constitution was to be ratified, it had to be ratified very, very quickly. And the people behind it, once the Constitution was proposed, recognized this. And there was a veritable blitzkrieg to get constitutional ratifying conventions in every state as quickly as possible. And I can't stress how important they saw this to be. Why was it important? Because the cities could organize. The commercial interests were very organized. They controlled the mail systems and such. And only if you got these conventions organized quickly could you kind of counteract the eventual effect of the people opposed. In other words, the backwoods people would take a long time to organize effective opposition. So the Federalists, the pro-Constitution people, put in effect a blitzkrieg to get the Constitution ratified by getting various conventions called in various states. This was done very fast, and they knew that time was against them. And people you should read on this, a very good historian, Merrill Jensen, has written a number of books. He tends to be very sympathetic to the point of view I'm giving you here. He's not by any means a libertarian. He takes more of an economic interpretation of what's going on here. But Merrill Jensen has written a number of books. One is called The Articles of Confederation, where he is very skeptical of the claims made against the Articles, that he thought they worked rather well, actually, as a lot of the people did at the time. If you read Patrick Henry's speech against the Constitution, he said, well, they say the Articles of Confederation have not worked. Well, what's wrong with them? They seem we're in peace, we're prosperous. What's the problem here? They did not buy that argument about somehow the country was in turmoil. Merrill Jensen has also written another very good book called The New Nation, which deals somewhat with the ratification controversy and so forth. Another book I highly recommend. So anything by Merrill Jensen, generally speaking, I would recommend that you read. Let me give you an example. Now, this is admittedly, again, an isolated case, but it is not an unusual case. I'm giving you only one. There are certain states that were key states if the Constitution was to be ratified, and there are certain states that were shoo-ins. They knew Pennsylvania would ratify it, Virginia they thought would not. New York, they were very worried about New York. A lot of Hamilton's intrigue and so forth went on in the state of New York. Have you all heard of the famous Federalist Papers written by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay? Okay, the famous Federalist Papers, considered one of the great political documents or series of documents in American history. They were written specifically as, in effect, and I don't mean this in a derogatory sense, they were written specifically as political propaganda in the state of New York to win over New York to the cause of ratification. They were written by three very strong proponents of the Constitution at that time. Madison later changes. He becomes an anti-Hamiltonian. He shifts on this. But at that time, he was a very strong nationalist. So you have Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and Madison writing the Federalist Papers to get New Yorkers to support it. Now, that's usually what you see reprinted in your text now. They talk about the Federalist Papers, and I'm so glad now that the so-called anti-Federalist Papers are available, because now you're going to see the other side of it. When I was in school, I'm in high school, I thought the Federalist Papers, that was about it. I didn't realize there was an equally large body of literature attacking the Constitution. It wasn't really brought out that clearly, to say the least. It's not that unusual now. Certainly in college courses, I would hope in American history courses it's brought out rather well. But consider the case of Pennsylvania. The legislature of Pennsylvania was just about to adjourn. But it was important that before they adjourn, that there be some agreement among the delegates that to call a convention in the state to appoint delegates to a constitutional convention in order to ratify or not ratify. You see what I'm getting at here? The people wanted, it was important that the convention be called and approved by the Pennsylvania legislature before they adjourned, because they didn't want any time to elapse. So what happened was that the proponents of ratification, who were by far in the majority, were going to push this through very quickly. Literally like on the last couple days before the legislature was scheduled to adjourn. The anti-federalists in Pennsylvania, who were in a minority, could not stop the majority from winning at that point. But what they could stop was a quorum. They simply left the legislature and prevented a quorum from occurring, and there were not enough, therefore a quorum being you have to have a certain number of people before you can even vote, and therefore they prevented a vote from taking place, hoping to delay the vote until the next legislature was sitting, until they could get time to organize their forces against the Constitution. Now, how did the pro-Constitution people deal with this? Well, I'll give you an example. When the anti-federalists stayed away from the legislative floor, the Federalists sent out a captain, a military captain, John Barry, who took with him a Federalist mob and tried to find where these delegates were staying. Where were they hiding? They found the mob, and they managed to capture two of them, which happened to be just the amount they needed for a quorum. The two men's names were James McCalmont and Jacob Miley, not important. They physically dragged them back to the house where the legislature was meeting and locked them in the room. In other words, now they had a technical quorum. Now they could vote. Now, McCalmont was a fiery Scots-Irish type, and he got up and begged to be excused. But nevertheless, he was counted present on the roll call. Now, the rules of the assembly were read to McCalmont, and it was said that every member who did not answer to the roll call, because McCalmont refused to say here when his name was called, every member who was present but did not answer was liable to a fine of 2 shillings, or 5 shillings if the refusal resulted in lack of a quorum. At this point, McCalmont reaches into his pocket, pulls out the money, and says, "Here, take it," but he refuses to submit, and he says, "Let me go." In fact, the quote is, "Well, sir, here's your 5 shillings, so let me go." There was a gallery of observers. They all broke into laughter. Now, a solemn debate occurred on this last day of the Pennsylvania legislature as to whether McCalmont was technically present or not. There was a rather heated debate. Was this man present or wasn't he? He made a dash to the door to try to get out. The sergeant of arms grabbed him, sat him back down, and the debate continued. It was finally decided after solemn debate that McCalmont was in fact present. So the vote took place, and the vote, of course, was on the side of convening a convention to decide the issue of the Constitution. Now, I could give you story after story of cases in the case of Massachusetts, which looked as if it would clearly go against the Constitution, ratification of the Constitution, where people who were elected on an anti-Constitution ground suddenly changed their vote and had obviously been bought off by the Federalists. There's a famous case in Massachusetts of, you remember that a lot of these anti-Federalist types are, as I said, backcountry types. They're not wealthy people. They have to leave their farms and attend this constitutional convention. They go with a mandate to vote against the Constitution. There's existing letters between Federalists which say, in effect, let them know that if they vote our way, we will be more than happy to pay their expenses for them right away. But if they don't vote our way, they're going to have to wait a while. You see, this is the type of stuff that was going on. This type of politicking went on extensively. And the only reason I'm giving you these examples is to let you know that politics then was pretty much like politics now. There isn't a lot of difference. And I'm just trying to, in case you have any of this sort of teary-eyed reverence for the Constitution, that all of us got together at some point, all the Americans, a great and wonderful document, we're all for it. It just wasn't like that. It was very bitterly fought and very bitterly debated. As I said, Jefferson himself was very suspicious of it. And Sam Adams, there's a question why Sam Adams eventually gave in. There's a question whether the eventual governor of Virginia had not been bribed by being given these continental certificates. You remember these IOUs I mentioned? He suddenly had a lot of them in his possession right after the vote. There was a lot of bribing going on. There was a lot of pressuring. In one case, a funny case of a bunch of guys being taken out for a nice drinking spree, and they didn't happen to be there when the vote took place, and which won it for the other side. But you can go state by state, and in most of the states you see shenanigans like this going on. Because, as I said, the pro-Constitution people tended to be far more astute, they were far more organized, they controlled the mails. By the way, I should mention the mails issue. The mails were a problem for the Anti-Federalists because even Jefferson and these people, not Jefferson, but the Jeffersonians, they would send letters to each other and never get there. Or they'd take months to arrive. And there were constant complaints by the Anti-Federalists that, in fact, the Federalists were monkeying with the mails, which they clearly were. They were stopping correspondence between an attempt to organize between the various factions of the Anti-Federalists. So just keep a sense of political reality when you think about ratification of the Constitution. An immense number of Americans were opposed to it because they did see it, as I said, as a betrayal of the principles of '76, because it gave enormous power, especially by the standards of that day, it gave enormous power to the central government. Okay, one other thing I'm going to mention about the Constitution and the motive for it. There occurs on 13th of November, approximately, 1787, something called Shays' Rebellion, which was basically a tax uprising, a tax revolt in Massachusetts. Now, Shays' Rebellion is on the lips of all of the advocates of the U.S. Constitution. They're saying, see, this is what happens when you don't have an energetic central government. People revolt against taxes. It wasn't a very serious revolt, even. I mean, the Anti-Federalists were scratching their heads saying, gee, isn't that what we fought the war over? They were kind of concerned that a tax revolt in America was being used as justification for a stronger central government because they saw shades of the British again and the British system. Now, there's some famous quotes from, now you have to understand, I'm going to use Jefferson as a model here, although he was kind of mixed on the Constitution. He was in France at the time. Madison wrote to him about Shays' Rebellion. It was all hysterical. There was a rebellion in Massachusetts against taxes. We need a strong government. Everyone got hysterical about Shays' Rebellion. And it became one of the major, not theoretical issues, but more major events that gave a lot of impetus to ratification. But now listen to how Jefferson talks about Shays' Rebellion in a letter back to Madison. Now, by the way, these quotations I'm giving you are quite famous. You may have heard them before. Most people don't understand where they come from. They think they come from the years with the war with the British. They don't. Jefferson is talking about a tax uprising, a revolt in the United States of America. Listen to what he says in 1787 regarding this tax revolt. Quote, God forbid we should ever be 20 years without such a rebellion. What country can preserve its liberties if their rulers are not warned from time to time that their people preserve their spirit of resistance? Let them take arms. The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is its natural manure. He also said around the same period of time, now that's a very famous quotation, but you'd be surprised how many people believe that it is referring to the American Revolution. It's not. It's referring to Shays' Rebellion, which is a revolt against the American government. He said around the same time, quote, I hold it that a little rebellion now and then is a good thing and is as necessary to the political world as storms in the physical. Close quote. Jefferson was pretty hard line on stuff like this. Now, and that's the last thing I want to say about the Constitution. I want to now focus on this Jefferson versus Hamiltonian model that I set out before. I want to discuss what these opposing principles were, and first a little bit of historical background. Jefferson, as I said, was in France at the time of the ratification of the Constitution. He was called back to serve under the Washington administration, George Washington being unanimously elected as the first president of the United States. By the way, another problem with the post-war, post-revolt government is they tend to choose the military leaders. Another thing you should think about that often happens today also during rebellions, who gets appointed? The heroes, the military heroes. Okay, but Washington was a pretty good guy in this respect, and he did recognize the need for civilian control of the military. So what he wants is basically a bipartisan cabinet. Okay, he appoints Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury. He appoints Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State. These two men then come together under the same administration, Hamilton as Secretary of Treasury, Jefferson as Secretary of State, and thus begins one of the great ideological battles in all of American history. A debate that is with us still, a debate that goes throughout the rest of the 18th century, throughout the 19th century, and continues to this day. Because when Jefferson comes back from France, he did not know Hamilton very well. Hamilton had been a personal aide to George Washington during the American Revolution. Jefferson did not know much about him. He didn't have any particular reason to hate him or anything. He even cooperated with him to some extent when he first returned. But very quickly, Jefferson sees the handwriting on the wall. He sees what Hamilton is up to because Hamilton tells him. I mean, he's very clear about it. I mean, Jefferson, if you look at his recollections and his memoirs, you know, one thing, as Murray Rothbard once said, this is the age prior to public relations. And these people are kind of Randian villains. They're very principled people. Alexander Hamilton, in his own way, was a principled man. He had very strong beliefs about a strong central government, and he said them. One famous story that Thomas Jefferson relates is that I think he was at a dinner or something, and they were talking about the pictures that they like to adorn their walls with. And Jefferson said on his walls were his three great heroes, Newton, Bacon, and John Locke. His three great heroes in science and philosophy and political theory. Newton, Bacon, and Locke. And someone asked Hamilton, apparently, who he had on his wall, and he said, Julius Caesar. Hamilton was quite blunt about this sort of thing. He said he was driven by a lust for power. He didn't see anything wrong with that particularly. He was an interesting man. Some people would say that Aaron Burr, in killing him later in a duel, did a great service to America, but unfortunately Hamilton had done most of his work by then and most of his harm. Now, how can we contrast the Jeffersonian ideal with the Hamiltonian ideal? Okay? Let's try to do that a second. Let me try to do it through two contrasting quotations. The first one from Thomas Jefferson is a bit longer. I apologize for reading such a long quotation, but it summarizes very well the Jeffersonian ideal. Now, note that I said the ideal, not necessarily the practice. In his 2 terms as president, beginning in 1800, the first term of Jefferson was pretty good. The second term was abysmal in many respects. Jefferson himself became rather ashamed of some of the things he had done in office. Some of his motives were good. In the second term, for example, trying to stay out of this conflict between France and England, the Napoleonic Wars, in his effort to stay out of that, he imposed a trade embargo, an absolute trade embargo with either country. There was smuggling then going on in America. He was then trying to crack down on smugglers and even advocated that a couple of them be hanged. So we find Jefferson, involved in a revolutionary cause earlier in life, suddenly advocating that smugglers be hanged. But, on the other hand, he was trying to stay out of a war because he knew that if the American ships were plundered, as they were being by both the French and the British, that America might be dragged into war. And the Federalists would get their war hoop going and say, crush the evil French. And you thought this might be a way of keeping America out of it. So in a sense, his motives were good, but his comrades in arms attacked him bitterly for selling out his own principles. The Louisiana Purchase, purchasing this vast expanse of land from France, is another example. It was unconstitutional. They had no constitutional powers to do that. And yet Jefferson was the great strict constructionist, as they like to call themselves. That is a strict construction, a strict interpretation of the Constitution. Jefferson winked at the Louisiana Purchase. It was just too good to pass up. It was like, here's this whole country, we'll give it to you for nothing, practically. Okay, I'll take it. But Jefferson said, he was very honest. He said, I cannot justify this according to the constitutional powers of the presidency. He couldn't justify it, but he did it anyway. That's what I mean, the ideal, not necessarily the practice. I'm not trying to whitewash Thomas Jefferson. He owned slaves. There's a lot of problems with Jefferson. Okay, but here's what Jefferson said in a letter in 1799, which summarizes very... I am for a government rigorously frugal and simple, applying all the possible savings of the public revenue to the discharge of the national debt, and not for the multiplication of officers and salaries merely to make partisans and for increasing by every device the public debt on the principle of its being a public blessing. I am for relying for internal defense on our militia solely till actual invasion, and for such a naval force only as may protect our coasts and harbors, and not for a standing army, that is a professional army maintained in peacetime, in time of peace, which may overawe the public sentiment, nor for a navy which by its own expenses and the eternal wars in which it will implicate us will grind us with public burdens and sink us under them. I am for free commerce with all nations, political connection with none, and little or no diplomatic establishment. In fact, when Jefferson became president, he cut down the diplomatic establishment to only 3 countries, France, Spain, and England, I believe. And I am not for linking ourselves by new treaties with the quarrels of Europe, entering that field of slaughter to preserve their balance, or joining in the confederacy of kings to war against the principles of liberty. I am for freedom of religion, for freedom of the press, and against all violations of the Constitution and against all violations of the Constitution to silence by force and not by reason the complaints or criticisms, just or unjust, of our citizens against the conduct of their agents. These, my friend, are my principles. They are unquestionably the principles of the great body of our fellow citizens. Now you find in one letter, nicely written letter, all the principles involved here. Very low amount of government expense, very low military, great opposition to militarism, great opposition to the Army, the Navy, in any big sense, staying out of foreign adventurism, staying close to home, that sort of thing. Now let me take a brief passage from Alexander Hamilton around the same time. By the way, this is where Jefferson got the phrase a national blessing. Hamilton said, quote, and this is, by the way, only one of many things like this from Hamilton. It's really incredible. A national debt, if it is not excessive, will be to us a national blessing. It will be a powerful cement of the Union. It will also create a necessity for keeping up taxation to a degree, which, without being oppressive, will be a spur to industry. Close quote. He had a lot of stuff to say like this. Now, let me read this once more, because there's a lot in this other than just some kind of stupid remark. I mean, there's a whole theory behind this. A national debt, if it is not excessive, will be to us a national blessing. It will be a powerful cement of the Union. Okay, let me stop there. What does he mean, a powerful cement of the Union? Remember, I talked about Hamilton admiring the British system. Very important in the British system was this idea of patronage and the idea of the commercial interests of the nation being linked to the government. Have you ever heard of the Bank of England, the East India Company, all these companies? What did the Bank of England do? Well, the Bank of England loaned a lot of money to the British government. It was established as a war bank, essentially, to finance English wars in the late 17th century. It loaned money to the government and therefore relied on the government in power to repay the debt. The idea here was, if you get the commercial interests loaning money to the government as part of your general structure, then the commercial interests will tend to defend that government against rebels, against insurgents, against nonconformists. In other words, the cement of the Union means let's make the interests of the commercial sector the same as the interests of the government. This was a way, they thought, to preserve stability in government and prevent future upheavals. It was clearly modeled after the British system. This is what he meant. It will be a powerful cement to the Union. So make the commercial interests have a stake in the government, and they'll protect it. Just like the East India Company and the Bank of England always came to the defense of the British government whenever it was attacked. So, in other words, you've got one hand feeding the other, so to speak. You give special privileges to certain businesses. You give special monopoly privileges to a bank. You let it print money. You let it do all kinds of things. It gets rich, and in turn, it relies on you. And that's the way you cement the Union. It will also create a necessity for keeping up taxation to a degree, which, without being oppressive, will be a spur to industry. I'm going to have some economists explain that. I don't really, even for Hamilton, that seems a little bit bizarre. Now, Jefferson, as I said, comes back to America, and he's immediately, or almost immediately, mortified by what he finds there. He starts associating a Secretary of State with the rest of Washington's cabinet, and he is appalled. He said, concerning his first formal dinner after he got back, "I cannot describe the wonder and mortification with which the table conversations filled me. Politics were the chief topic, and a preference of kingly over republican government was evidently the favorite sentiment." Close quote. Now, he's referring to Hamilton and others in Washington's cabinet. Now, Jefferson, and he's often misunderstood on this, Jefferson kept saying that Hamilton wanted to reestablish a monarchy in America. He called him a monarcho man. That was the term he used. The monarcho men supposedly wanted to establish a monarchy. Now, modern historians look at this and they say, this is ridiculous. Hamilton did not literally want to establish a king in America. Well, that wasn't the point. Jefferson knew that. I mean, there wasn't much of a likelihood the Americans were going to put a hereditary king in power. But the point was not the idea of a monarchy per se, but the principles of a strong executive, which had the power of patronage to influence the votes in the various houses of the federal legislature. See, this is how the king got his power in England. It was through a system called patronage. I suppose you've probably heard of the word. That's its technical meaning. This is what Thomas Paine attacked when he wrote Common Sense, the great revolutionary pamphlet written published in January 1776. Patronage was a system basically bribing your so-called friends of the king. You've got your own little congressmen, you bribe them with places, with pensions, with lucrative jobs, and they vote the way you, the executive, wants them to. That was Hamilton's idea of a strong executive. And in fact, he did that. There's no question, but there were payoffs and there were favors bestowed, just like there are today. It's a system very much like we have today, where you have a lot of power and you can dispense privileges and patronage to your favorites, and they in turn vote your way. So when Jefferson talked about these people talking about reestablishing a kingly power or a monarchy, he didn't necessarily mean they wanted a king with a robe and a crown. He meant they wanted to set up a system whereby the executive had enormously strong power. But now, what about the executive? Did the king in England really exercise that much power? Well, in a sense, yes. But who really pulled the strings on a day-to-day basis? It was his cabinet, right? The prime minister, so-called, especially. Now, what was the prime minister? This gets back to a point I made earlier. What was the prime minister called in England, really? Prime minister wasn't a term used for quite a while. Well, he could have been Chancellor of the Exchequer very early on, or in this period known as First Lord of the Treasury. Okay? Now, the prime minister, in a sense, really controlled the power. He was the political power broker in England. So now, what position does Alexander Hamilton have in America? He is Secretary of the Treasury. He sees himself as the equivalent of First Lord of the Treasury. His function then becomes not simply to do the routine work that he was meant to do, but rather essentially to run the government. And this is what Hamilton tries to do. He goes way out of his sphere. He gets into all kinds of the other departments, tries to get involved in diplomacy. He sees himself as a prime minister, in effect, of America. And for him, Washington was to be rather a titular head. He was to be the kind of the grand old military hero. Hamilton would really run the government. Now, I can't tell you, and if you know American history in this period, you know this is true. At this time, Madison had swung over with Jefferson. They were awful. They were very, very afraid of Hamilton. Now, what made them even more afraid? Well, what was the worst? Go back to the Caesar. The picture of Caesar on the wall. In 1794, there was an uprising. This time in Pennsylvania, called the Whiskey Rebellion. There was the Federalists. Now, this was during the administration of John Adams. I know some of you aren't too familiar with American history, and it's hard to mention what's going on here in all cases. But John Adams succeeds George Washington as the second president of the United States. Okay? Now, the Federalists, as they are called, start putting all kinds of taxes into place, okay? Including an excise tax on whiskey. Now, whiskey in this area of Pennsylvania was used not just for drinking, it was used as almost a medium of exchange. It was easily transported. It was a very important part of the economy. And this was a very onerous tax on these people. And there was another tax uprising. What happens? Alexander Hamilton calls for the recruitment of 15,000 militia to invade Pennsylvania and crush the Whiskey Rebellion. Now, you're Thomas Jefferson, right? You've been with Alexander a lot. You've heard him talk a lot about Caesar and all this thing. What's your worst fear come true? Not only is this guy playing the prime minister, but he's also going to be the military director. Who is leading the army? Alexander Hamilton. Gets on his horse and leads the army, 15,000 of them, to crush the rebellion. When they get there, most of the rebels have dispersed. They manage to catch a couple of them. They're tried, sentenced to death, but Washington commutes the sentences, to his credit. But now, there's a lot that starts to happen during this period. Jefferson and his colleagues look at Hamilton and they become terrified. They think this man is a tyrant. He wants to take over not only the domestic policy, but the foreign policy. He wants to do everything. Okay, in the late 1790s, you have what is called the quasi-war with France. This had to do, really nothing to do with America, but it had to do with the depredations of American shipping by French vessels when America tried to take ships to Britain. But the British were doing the same thing. But this was a Federalist administration. Now, this is a very important distinction between the Federalists and the Jeffersonians. The Federalists were very anti-French and pro-British. The Jeffersonians were very pro-French and anti-British because of this whole British system and what they represented. The Jeffersonians were very pro-French Revolution. The Federalists, of course, were very anti-French Revolution. So the so-called quasi-war with France becomes very important because it leads to what, under the Adams administration, became known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. Now, these were laws passed. First of all, who were the aliens? French radicals. French who had come over to America and were supposedly Jacobins getting the seditious principles spread in America. The Alien Act allowed the president to export or deport seditious aliens, especially French aliens. The Sedition Act made it a crime to basically criticize the Adams administration. It's what it comes down to. You could not publish, print, utter, or any form speak about some kind of really rabid criticism of the Adams administration. Under these aliens, under sedition law, many Federalist newspaper editors went to jail. Many Republican, many Jeffersonian newspaper editors went to jail for publishing criticisms. Jefferson himself was followed. A lot of the Jeffersonians were followed, in effect, by a Secret Service type thing. Things are getting pretty serious by this time, from the point of view of Jefferson. Okay, what happens in 1800? Jefferson runs against Adams, and Jefferson wins through a complex process that's too complicated to explain right here, and I'm not sure I understand it myself exactly what went on, but you have what Jefferson called the Revolution of 1800. Jefferson said regarding this election that the Revolution of 1800 was, in its principles and form, as much of a revolution as the Revolution of 1775. Now, historians have tended to look at that somewhat with a jaundiced eye, saying, well, no, it really wasn't a real revolution. It was a peaceful transition. But remember what I said. They didn't think you had to have violence to have a revolution. He thought it was a return back to the principles of the American Revolution, and it was a real revolution. There's very little doubt, but that had Jefferson not won in 1800, had the Federalists continued their ways, there might have been another civil war in America. There had been violence already. There had been mob violence. And Jefferson himself was obviously looking for some sort of out if he did not win. Have you ever heard of the Virginia and Kentucky resolves written by Jefferson and Madison? These were written during this period in the late 1790s. And what they said, in effect, was that should the federal government pass any law which a state considers to be unconstitutional, the state has the right to nullify it. In other words, the state can nullify a federal law. These Kentucky and Virginia resolves had no constitutional power. They were more expressions of opinion. They were not really adopted in any formal or legal way. But they're very radical documents, if you've ever read them, very radical. They were later used as a justification by the southern states and theorists like John C. Calhoun during the so-called nullification controversy. I can't go into that, unfortunately. That's around the 1830s in that period. But more importantly, the Kentucky and Virginia resolves were used by the southern secessionists as part of their justification to the right of secession. They said, look, Madison and the father of the Constitution and Jefferson, who had a lot to do with the Bill of Rights, both of these men admitted the right of states individually to nullify federal law. Madison later denied this, but that's a long story. But you see what's happening here. There is a definite split beginning to occur. But Jefferson does get elected, and there is not the violence that there is not the violent outbreak that one might expect. I went through a little bit about Jefferson's terms. I can't really go into it here. Jefferson in his let me just say this. Jefferson in his first term basically dismantled to what extent he could the Federalist program. He eliminated all direct taxes. He cut the Army down to the bone. He eliminated the standing Army, really. He cut the Navy back down to a bunch of basically rafts floating around. There's a big debate with each other. These big ships are just kind of these, in effect, they amount to large rafts defending the coastline. One reason, as I indicated by that quotation, that Jefferson did not want large ships was because he knew large ships could be used to go overseas. He believed these smaller raft-type vessels could defend a coastline, but they could not be used for going across the ocean and getting involved in various imperialistic adventures. So here again we come back to that innate suspicion of the military. Not that the military are evil. That wasn't the view. It's just that power corrupts. People tend to use power when they can. And Jefferson himself believed that he was susceptible to the same corruption of power. Let me give you an example of this where Jefferson says this very clearly. Jefferson had a class theory. He talked about the sheep and the wolves. The wolves were the people in government, the sheep were everyone else. Here's how he talks about this in a letter. If once, meaning the public, if once the public becomes inattentive to the public affairs, then you and I and the Congress and the assemblies, judges, and governors shall all become wolves. It seems to be the law of our general nature. Close quote. Very important. He includes himself in this. If once the public becomes inattentive to public affairs, that is, once they stop checking the power of government, then everyone in government will become wolves, because he thought it was a general tendency of human nature. Now, to make a long story short, Jefferson basically cuts back the, I'm going to have to jump through a lot of history real fast here. Jefferson cuts back the Federalist state as much as he can. He makes a lot of mistakes, as I pointed out before. He gets out of office in 1808. He then looks back and kind of regrets that he was not able to do more. Jefferson believed that the Federalists had so entrenched the federal bureaucracy that there was no real turning back, that they had set up the institutional power structure and that the Republicans had not gotten to it in time to really turn back the clock. So he became something of a pessimist after he got out of office, because he thought that the government would just snowball, and whether it could be stopped or not, he was very suspicious that it could. Now, I'm going to move on. I really can't talk about the War of 1812, and there's a lot of stuff that goes on here. Basically, let me just give you this much at least as a background. I'll try to sketch what they call the three-party system so you understand the chronology here. There is in American history a scheme or a terminology called the three-party systems. The first party system is the one we've been discussing. This is what are often called the Republicans or the Jeffersonian Republicans versus the Federalists. Okay. Now, what happened to the Federalist Party? Well, the Federalist Party collapsed in 1812 with the so-called Hartford Convention. This, when it looked like America, or when America did go to war with England in 1812, the Federalists, being very pro-British, became anti-war. They held the famous Hartford Convention, in which they considered seceding, the New England Federalists considered seceding from the Union, because they were so horrified by war with England. They thought we should be fighting France, not England. Now, that basically made given the war spirit of the time, that made the Federalists very unpopular, and they essentially disintegrated as a political force. From around 1812, in that period, through to around, I'd say, well, let's pick an arbitrary date, 1830, you have what is called the era of good feelings, which is a very misleading term, but basically you have a one-party system in America. There are not two distinct parties. What happens in 1828 is a man, I'm jumping through, if you understand here, the administrations of Madison and Monroe. I'm sorry to have to do that, but there's not much choice here. I want to get into some other things. In 1828, Andrew Jackson was elected President of the United States. Jackson was a radical Jeffersonian in many ways. He vetoed the charter of the Second Bank of the United States. He was a states' writer type. He was also a bastard in some ways. I mean, Jackson is a fellow, because, but Jackson was a war hero also from the War of 1812. Battle of New Orleans, you all heard of that? That was after the war was over, by the way. It officially ended, but he was still a war hero. It was actually a very good military maneuver on his part. Jackson, aside from being a slave owner, another recurring hypocrisy involved here, was very, very, very bad on the Indian question, I mean, to put it mildly. Have you heard of the famous Trail of Tears, the forced removal of Indians from Georgia, where thousands of them died on this long forced march because the white man wanted their land that they had been guaranteed? Jackson was just awful on this, because the Supreme Court even supported the Indian claims. Now, you have to understand that these are not what we like to think of in American folklore as savages. I mean, so civilized that some of these Georgian Indians become, they had reached the pinnacle of white man civilization that some of them even owned slaves themselves. They were slave-owning Indians. That shows how highly cultured they were. So clearly they weren't like the old savages that didn't have slaves. They had black slaves, working the land for them. And as any civilized person in the South at that time would like to have, I guess. So anyway, these people were uprooted, forced out, and thousands of them died in the so-called Trail of Tears. And that I have to pinpoint specifically on Jackson. I have to put that on his head, because there's no question about it, and it was just an awful thing. But on the same token, he vetoes the rechartering of the Second Bank of the United States, so he did some good things as well. But Jackson represents something more to the anti-Jeffersonians. He represents the revival of the Jeffersonian ideal. This is after the administration of John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, there's a short Federalist revival. Then there's an organized opposition to the presidency of Jackson, who represents, at least in terms of economics, the kind of free trade principles and the anti-big government, anti-business government principles that Jefferson had talked about. So what happens around the 1830s is there comes into existence what's called the second party system, and this time we have the Democrats. Now, this is where the terminology gets confusing. The Democrats at this point are the same as the former Republicans, the Jeffersonian Republicans. This is the party of Andrew Jackson. You have the Democrats versus what became known as the Whig Party. Now, it really gets confusing here, because here the Whigs end up being the bad guys. They call themselves Whigs because they know the term is a very popular one, because Jefferson called himself a Whig, and they see themselves opposing an imperious kind of fellow in the White House. So the Whig Party is formed. Now, what is the Whig Party? Where does it get its support? The Whig Party is formed as part of a general evangelical revival that's called the Second Great Awakening, which runs in America from roughly 1790 through around 1850 even. The Second Great Awakening in America is extremely significant, because all the reform movements that came out of the 1820s, 1830s, were part of this evangelical revival. It's often called pietism. Let me just bring this board down. I'll give you some books on this because this is a complicated subject. Oops, that's not going to work. Yeah, that'll work. Good. If you want an excellent work on this, he's written several books. The works of Paul Kleppner. This is the so-called ethnocultural school of American history, but the words don't mean anything here. It's not important. Discusses this sort of thing, particularly in his book called The Cross of Culture, about the various ethnic conflicts going on here, and I can't really deal with them all. But what you have in the so-called Whig Party are New England and upstate New York evangelicals who are caught up in this Protestant revival movement and who then put forward a big crusade for kind of a homogeneous America. In other words, America that has all the same values. You've got a lot of foreigners coming in, you've got a lot of problems, and they're going to stamp out sin in America. The Whig Party becomes the party of purity. It becomes the party of moral virtue. The Democratic Party becomes the party of individual liberty. Now, people like Kleppner have done research on this and found that in terms of ethnic groups, there's almost a perfect correspondence between what groups belong to one party and what groups belong to the other. If you were from New England, you're likely to be in the Whig Party. If you were an Irish immigrant, if you were a German immigrant, you're likely to belong to the Democratic Party. The ethnic backgrounds of the people become extremely significant here. I mean, very, very significant. And I can't overstress how significant they are. Out of the 1830s in particular, there come a number of reform movements in America that are to become very significant. Some of them are things like temperance reform, that is the prohibition of drinking. Sabbatarian law reform comes out of this period, that is the restricting of activity on the Sabbath. A lot of this material, a lot of these laws, by the way, were aimed at, for example, German immigrants, because the Germans liked their beer and they liked to drink it on Sunday at picnics, and the New Englands were horrified. They just were horrified. And a lot of these laws were aimed at these particular immigrant groups. A lot of the temperance laws later on were aimed at the Irish, who would meet in their pubs, and the pubs were often, these saloons were often the kind of center of political activity. The local boss would meet there, and the bartender knew everyone, and it was how the city local democratic machines were run, were through the saloons. The attempt to close down these saloons had more than significance than simply prohibiting alcohol. They were an attempt to damage kind of the political structure of the immigrant Democratic Party in places like New York. Okay, the reform movement I want to talk about for a few minutes is by far the most significant. It's the anti-slavery movement. The anti-slavery movement, or the radical wing of it, arises in the early 1830s, and the main character here is a man named William Lloyd Garrison, who in 1831 begins a newspaper called The Liberator, which is destined to run for 3.5 decades until the Civil War. Now, Garrison came out of this pietistic Whig culture, but he in this case, took up the right reform, but with a great deal of evangelical fervor and very punchy writer. Within a few months after Garrison started putting out The Liberator, there was a price of $5,000 on his head put out by the Georgia legislature for anyone who captured or brought to Georgia William Lloyd Garrison. So seditious was considered The Liberator that, for example, in Georgetown, in the District of Columbia, if a free black tried to take a copy of The Liberator from the mails, if he tried to go to the post office and pick one up, he was subject to fine and to imprisonment. The reaction to The Liberator, you would be tarred and feathered in most southern states if you were caught with a copy of it. That's how radical it was. Around the same time, a number of things happened. There was a Nat Turner slave uprising. Garrison did not time his paper very well, because it basically came at the same time as a Nat Turner uprising, which was a slave revolt where a number of families were wiped out by slaves. In other words, the anti-slavery movement begins to really take hold in the 1830s. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the anti-slavery movement because not only for its own sake, it's very important, but it gets us into the Civil War, and also the anti-slavery movement was the schooling place, so to speak, of a lot of later American libertarians like Lysander Spooner. Have you all heard of Lysander Spooner? Lysander Spooner came out of the anti-slavery movement. He wrote originally anti-slavery pamphlets, and I'll be discussing him later. But let me tell you just now, for those of you who've heard of Spooner, and No Treason, the famous work, I imagine a lot of you have. These were not just men of words, they were also men of action. You've heard of John Brown, John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859, the attempt to capture the government armory in Virginia, and then that John Brown with some of his compatriots led in the hope to incite a slave insurrection in the South through guerrilla warfare. That was John Brown's scheme. It's very likely he was financed by some of Spooner's friends. Then he actually may have gotten the plan for creating a slave uprising from something that Spooner had written. After John Brown had been captured and was being tried, it was clear he would be hanged. I mean, there's no doubt about that. Spooner, along with Gerrit Smith and some of these other radical types, they never launched it, but they talked about in their correspondence a plan to kidnap the governor of Virginia, Governor Wise, and take him out to sea and hold him as a hostage until Virginia agreed to release John Brown before they hanged him. Now, that plan never went anywhere. Some of these guys were better at planning these things than actually executing them. But that gives you an insight into Spooner. You may know him only as the author of some interesting works, but he was very much wrapped up in this anti-slavery movement. Now, there's three important branches of the anti-slavery movement that I want to mention. The first is the branch led by William Lloyd Garrison, and this is called the moral. The reason, by the way, I'm mentioning some of this is because the strategy issues are very close to some of the strategy discussions that go on today in modern libertarian circles. William Lloyd Garrison represented what he called moral suasion. That was his strategy. Now, moral suasion meant that you try to end slavery through convincing the slaveholders eventually that it's immoral through the pressure of public opinion, so on and so forth. Garrison personally was a pacifist. He didn't believe in violence, even in self-defense. He certainly was against war, although he later sold out his own principles in the Civil War. Garrison also represented that part of the anti-slavery movement which called for the secession of the northern states from the southern states. He was a disunion man. Very early on in the 1830s, 1840s, he was calling for the secession of the northern states from the southern states. He did not like the Union. On the masthead of the Liberator, in bold letters, it says, "The U.S. Constitution is a covenant with death and an agreement with hell." That's the motto of the Liberator. Pretty punchy language. It's a slogan. I even have an autographed picture of Garrison where a little thing like this says, "No union with slaveholders," written in Garrison's hand. That was one of his favorite mottos. The idea here was that the one reason that slavery continued to exist is because of the fugitive slave laws, which meant that if a slave escaped to the northern states, he had to be returned by law to the south. And Garrison believed that if the North seceded from the South, the slaves would be free when they crossed the border. That would encourage far more slave escapes. If you're a slave and you know you're going to be sent back, there's not a lot of encouragement. You have to go all the way to Canada. But if you know if you can just reach to the North, you'll be free, then that would indeed be a motive for slaves to escape. That was a lot of the reasoning behind the disunion movement that Garrison led. He wanted disunion to occur, but he wanted the North to lead it. Okay. There was disillusionment with the moral suasion approach, particularly after the Congress gagged so-called anti-slavery petitions. They would not even consider anti-slavery petitions, particularly under Jackson. So there arose the political strategy, or the political wing. That is the wing of the anti-slavery movement which wanted to end slavery by forming an anti-slavery political party. This was done in the 1840s with the formation of what was known as the Liberty Party. The Liberty Party went nowhere. Its formers claimed that they would be controlling the government in 20 years. It went nowhere. It never elected anyone to anything. The Liberty Party, or remnants of it, later kind of merges into what became known as the Free Soil Party, which you may have heard of, which was somewhat more effective. I won't write that. It's not that important. The Free Soil Party was a watered-down version of the Liberty Party, which did not aim for the abolition of slavery, but rather aimed for its non-extension into the territories. They believed that people advocating slave uprisings in the South, wanting people to go in and gather escaped slaves, capture arms, get more slaves around them, attack plantations, run up in the hills, and conduct guerrilla-style warfare to free the slaves. These were the three major approaches to the slavery question. As to which was the more successful, certainly Garrison had the most effect. He was the most widely heard and the most influential of them. But that leads us directly into, and I'm skipping a lot of stuff here, but that leads us directly into the issue of the Civil War. Which is what I want to spend the rest of the time on this lecture on, because it's very important, as you can well imagine. Now, if there's any kind of mythology in American history, it has to be over Lincoln, the man named Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator, right? Now, what can we say about Lincoln and the causes of the war? I would ask here if there's anyone who believes that the Civil War was begun over slavery, except you'd be too embarrassed to raise your hand even if you believed it, because you know that I'm going to say that's not what was started over. Lincoln was an Illinois politician. This image of him as kind of a backwoods, he was a nice guy, he told funny stories and such, and he was against slavery, don't misunderstand me. But the idea of him kind of a rambling country bumpkin raised in a log cabin, You know, he was a very astute. He was a railroad lawyer most of his life. Very astute politician, very smart, knew what he was doing. You don't get in that position of power being a bumpkin. I mean, let's face it. Very astute man, and please don't think of Lincoln as some kind of nice guy and he just happens to become president. How did he get to be president? Well, this is a story in itself. The 1850s in America was an extremely turbulent period. A lot of things were happening. Most significant for our purposes here, what happened in 1854 was an act called the Nebraska Act, sometimes called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This is in 1854. Now, the dates here aren't too important as long as you get the general time framework. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, well, first let me say the Nebraska Territory was an immense territory, far larger than the state of Nebraska today, an immense territory, huge. And it was clear that the Nebraska Territory, as westward expansion occurred, that there would be states carved out of this territory, the first one being Kansas. That's why it's sometimes called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The question is, should slavery be allowed in these new states that were going to be carved out of the Nebraska Territory? That was the great political question. Why was it important? Was it because they wanted slaves in Nebraska? Not necessarily, no. The slave powers recognized that slavery was simply uneconomic in certain parts of the country where they couldn't have large plantation-type farming. The reason that was important was because of the political power. That is, your representatives in Congress, which then voted on certain economic issues. The northern industrialists tended to be very high tariff types, the kind of the Whigs. The southern agriculturalists tended to be more free trade. And the Southerners were legitimately very afraid that if they lost their power in Congress, they were going to be subjected to high taxes, high tariffs, etc. The slavery issue became sort of a kind of a side issue in a sense. It was like it wasn't that they wanted slavery in Nebraska so much as they wanted the slave state, so to speak, to control that area. So the representatives would then vote on correct issues regarding free trade and so forth. So the political significance becomes very important because you get 2 senators for every new state, right? That's going to be very important as the Southern Democrats see their power waning in Congress. All right. There was something called the Missouri Compromise of 1820. It's a very complex story, but essentially, according to the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which admitted Missouri as a slave state, it was agreed that anything north of a certain line would, when it entered the Union, would not be a slave state. That's called the Missouri Compromise. The Nebraska Act, the Nebraska Territory, by that compromise, should not have been permitted to be a slave territory. Okay? That's the short of it. It was, by the Missouri Compromise, Nebraska should not have been a slave territory. Then along comes a man named Stephen Douglas, of the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates. You've all heard that, from Illinois. This is the great age of expansion of railways. And every senator wants a railroad through his state, right? Because the government's financing, it's a real pork barrel type legislation. How do you get support for a railway through your state? Well, one way is you go to the southern politicians and you say, look, you support my railroad. I'm sure you're surprised that this ever happens. You support my railroad through Illinois, and I'll push through Congress this Nebraska Act, which under the rubric of squatter sovereignty, let the voters decide whether there should be slavery or not, will then effectively repeal the Missouri Compromise of 1820. This is what Stephen Douglas did. The result of that was the Nebraska Act, which said the settlers themselves would decide if there was to be slavery in those territories. This act had enormous, not only practical, but political implications as well. First of all, it split the Democratic Party. Not all Democrats by far, believe me, were pro-slavery. The Northern Democrats, many of them were disgusted. They bolted the Democratic Party. The eventual result of this act was to split the Democratic Party ticket in 1860, which allowed Abraham Lincoln, a relatively unknown Illinois politician, to get the presidency with the Republican Party. The Republican Party is the so-called third electoral system, Republican-Democrat. It was formed around 1856 from a coalition of old parties that had disintegrated. The old Federalists, the old Whigs, the old Free Soilers. It was an amalgam. It was a combination of various parties that had disintegrated. It could not have won the election had not the Democratic Party split its ticket, because Lincoln did not win a majority of the votes. He won a plurality. Okay. Now, what was Lincoln's attitude about slavery? Lincoln was a former member of the Whig Party. It's very significant. A former member of the Whig Party, an extreme nationalist. And there was no way he was going to let the Union dissolve. He was very much against the right of secession. He said on any number of occasions, like in his famous remark, if I could save the Union by not freeing a single slave, I would not free a single slave. If I could save the Union by freeing all the slaves, I would free all the slaves. What I do for the black man in regard to slavery, I do solely for the sake of the Union. Lincoln was very, very clear about this. He did not, try to reinforce Fort Sumter and all that, which led to the fighting, from any concern about slavery. It was an issue of political union. Now, I can't go through all of this, let me say, first of all, when Lincoln was elected, South Carolina led the Deep South in seceding from the Union, right? The states in the northern part of the South, like Virginia, did not secede until actual shots were fired at Fort Sumter. They followed later, okay? Now, I'm not saying Lincoln wanted war. I'm not suggesting that, but nobody probably wants war in that sense. But he thought that probably the Confederacy would not last very long. Most everyone thought this would be a short war. But let me talk to you a little bit before I get into the war itself about Lincoln's attitude about slavery. He despised it, like a lot of these Whigs did. But he was a political creature, and he had his own priorities. He was an extreme gradualist. A gradualist was one who was against slavery, but who believed that slavery should be phased out in increments. Now, when I say extreme, I mean extreme. How many of you have heard that Lincoln in 1859 suggested that slavery should be phased out over a period of 100 years? Now, by Lincoln's timetable, slavery in America would have ended in 1959 if the man had his original way. What happened was, the Civil War begins, or the war between the states, for those of you from southern states, or the war for southern independence if you're really crazy about it. I prefer the war between the states myself, often called the Civil War. Lincoln states very clearly in his first inaugural address that he has no intention of monkeying with the institution of slavery. Listen to what he says in his first inaugural address. Now, this is not the usual sort of stuff you see quoted from Lincoln. Apprehension seems to exist among the people of the southern states that by the accession of a Republican administration, their property and their peace and personal security are to be endangered. There has never been any reasonable cause for such apprehension. Indeed, the most ample evidence to the contrary has all the while existed and been open to their inspection. It is found in nearly all the published speeches of him who now addresses you. I do but quote from one of those speeches when I declare that I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. Those who nominated and elected me did so with full knowledge that I had made this and many similar declarations, and have never recanted them, and never did, by the way. Now, how much clearer can you be than that? And this is part of his political platform, the promise not to interfere with slavery in states where it already existed. He did adopt the Free Soil Party of not wanting its extension of the territories, but he was not advocating its abolition in slave states. Now we turn to what is perhaps the most cynical document ever written in American history and one of the most misunderstood, the famous Emancipation Proclamation. We've all heard of that. It freed the slaves, right? No, it did not free the slaves. There were two versions of the Emancipation Proclamation. The first said, if by January 1st in any rebel states that do not come back over to the Union, all slaves in those states will be declared free forever. If you came back into the Union, you would be able to keep your slaves by the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, you have to remember that there were 4 slave states in the Union that still permitted slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation had nothing to do with slavery in those states. It still permitted slavery in those states. It was purely and solely and cynically a war measure, as the proclamation itself says. I don't know if you've ever read the Emancipation Proclamation, but you really should. Let me just read a little bit of it here, and you'll get a flavor of what I mean. This is the famous Emancipation Proclamation. Whereas on the 22nd of September, in the year of our Lord, 1862, a proclamation was issued by the President of the United States containing, among other things, the following, to wit, that on the first day of January in the year of our Lord, 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then thenceforward and forever free, and the executive government of the United States holding military and naval authority, etc., etc. Now, that's very clear, but now listen to this. I'll just read sections of it here. It's quite long. Now, therefore, I, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, by virtue of the power in me vested as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States, in time of actual and armed rebellion against the authority and government of the United States, and as a fit and necessary war measure for suppressing said rebellion, due on this first day of January in the year of our Lord, 1863, in accordance with blah, blah, blah. And then he lists exceptions, even in the slave states. He says, these are the states to which this proclamation applies. Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, parentheses, except the parishes of St. Bernard, Jefferson, St. John, St. Charles, St. James, Ascension, Assumption. I'm not even cutting a lot of these out. In other words, these are pockets of Union sympathizers within these slave areas, so they're going to be allowed to keep their slaves. This is the Great Emancipation Proclamation. He said, then he goes on, end of parentheses after about 12 exceptions. Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, parentheses, except the 48 counties designated as West Virginia, and also the counties of Berkeley, Accomack, Northampton, Elizabeth City, York, Princess Anne, and Norfolk, including the cities of Norfolk and Portsmouth, end parentheses, and which accepted parts are for the present left precisely as if this proclamation were not issued. In other words, he's saying, yes, you're all free to accept in the free states, in the Union states, and in all these little counties in the slave states. Now, not many people know this. I guess people don't bother to read the original documents. But what was the reasoning behind this? The reasoning was that, and the abolitionists had pressured Lincoln to issue an Emancipation Proclamation for precisely this reason. The reasoning was that if the Southerners are afraid of a slave uprising, they'll have to send more soldiers back to the plantations to watch them. And therefore, they won't have as many men to put on the line. That was the first reason. The second reason was because of the opinion in Europe. England was very sympathetic with the South. It had certain economic ties, obviously, with the cotton, but it was also sympathetic with the cause of independence of the South. And Lincoln knew at this point in time that it was essential to keep the European powers, particularly England, from recognizing the Southern Confederacy as an independent nation. And he also suspected that if he did declare emancipation, at least to a certain extent, it would swing English public opinion over to his side. And in fact, this is what happened. Had the Emancipation Proclamation not been issued, it's very likely that England would have recognized Southern independence and possibly even provided aid to it. Because a lot of the so-called Confederate privateers, the ships that were commissioned to kind of go around trying to capture booty from Union ships, a lot of them were made in England and actually docked there for repairs and such. Now, I'm going to finish up with a few comments about the Civil War. If I can't get through this all, I'll pick it up in the next lecture. I'm going to begin by giving you a quotation from an excellent book on the Civil War. And if you're going to read one book, I would recommend this one. I think it's a very fair, I don't agree with everything in it. I think but as a general text, I think it's about the best I've seen. It's James McPherson, and it's called Ordeal by Fire. It's a quite recent book, and it's become I'm glad to hear, a very standard text now in a lot of college courses. And I'm really glad to hear this, because it's really a wonderful book in a lot of ways, very informative. And it's very balanced. It comes as close as you can be to not being partisan, and it's still a very emotional issue. But let me read to you one passage of McPherson where he talks about the expectations of the Civil War. He says that everyone involved in it, virtually everyone, with the exception of people like Sherman, expected it to be short. The Confederates thought that the Yankees couldn't fight, that they had been trained on horses and in military academies, and they could win the war quickly. The Union side thought that the war would be quick, and so forth. And they also had a rather noble conception of what warfare was. Here's how McPherson words this. Men on both sides rushed to enlist before the war was over. They had only the vaguest and most romantic notions of what war was like. Their vision was of bands, banners, massed formations, marching in brilliant sunshine over open fields to glorious victories in which death, if it came, would be painless and honorable. Few could envisage the mud or choking dust, the bone-deep fatigue, the searing thirst and gnawing hunger, the bitter cold or enervating heat of the march or the bivouac, the boredom of camp life, the gut-tearing pain of dysentery, or the delirious ravings of typhoid in a primitive army hospital, the smoke, noise, confusion, and terror of battle, the blood and screams and amputated limbs of the surgeon's tent. Even those who foresaw a long war could scarcely conceive of the massive mobilization of men and resources this war would require, or the savage destruction of men and resources it would accomplish. Now, the Civil War is one of the great turning points in American history. It's those of you who have studied it, I know there are a lot of Civil War buffs around. It's hard for me to be a Civil War buff because it is such a gruesome, awful thing. It's just painful to read about it if you have a sense of immediacy. Let me give you an example. I can't go through the battles and that sort of thing. The Civil War, there's a lot of speculation as to why the Civil War took such a toll in human life. You have to understand, the Civil War took 620,000 American lives. That is almost more than all Americans who have died in every war America has ever fought, combined. Now, obviously, there's Americans on both sides being killed. That accounts for a lot of it. But it was an immensely destructive war just in terms of human life. And we're talking about a population in the mid-19th century. In one war, more people died, almost more people died than all the Americans that have ever died in every war America's been in. Now think about that. That's kind of tells you something about how destructive this war was. Disease was one of the major factors in this. For every one person that died in battle, 2 men died of disease. They had no way of controlling this. The facilities were very primitive. Amputations, as you know, were common. They had no way of dealing with an infected leg. Let me try to emphasize to you the sheer bloody nature of this war by talking about one battle that took 1 day. This is the Battle of Antietam. Antietam, the most bloody day in the history of American warfare. Now, I won't go through the whole history of this. It has to do with Lee taking his army into the north to invade. He's in Maryland. There's this little small creek called Antietam Creek. The Confederates called this the Battle of Sharpsburg. All right. I won't go through all the military aspects of it. But you had an army under Lee of about 45,000 men facing an army under General George McClellan for the Union facing of about 75,000 men. Okay, Union troops under a general named Joseph Hooker and Joseph Mansfield crossed Antietam Creek on September 16th with 12,000 troops. They entered a grove known thereafter as the North Woods. Now this is basically, there was a part of this North Woods which was a 40-acre cornfield, and in this cornfield were hiding Confederate soldiers. The Union soldiers blasted this cornfield with artillery and musketry. Here's how Hooker described the results. Quote, "Every stalk of corn was cut as clearly as with a knife, and the slain lay in rows precisely as they had stood in their ranks a few minutes before." Close quote. The Confederates counterattacked. They hit 2,200 men in 20 minutes of fire. The cornfield was so littered with bodies, Union and Confederate, that one man said that you could not literally walk across it and touch the ground. That's how littered it was with bodies. Small, and we're not even talking about the full 40 acres here. Before noon, there were 13,000 casualties. By night, 2,100 Yanks and 2,700 Confederates had died, and there were 18,500 wounded. 3,000 of those died eventually. As I said, it's the single bloodiest day of the war and the single bloodiest day of any war. For a little bit of comparison, consider American casualties at D-Day. Now D-Day, right? About 6,000 casualties. Not killed, but casualties. That's only 1/4 of the casualties, American casualties at Antietam in 1 day. Now, perhaps I can best give you a picture of what this means. In 1 day of fighting in this cornfield, if you've ever seen pictures of this, it's just ghastly. It's just gruesome. There's bodies everywhere, and they rotted here and spread disease for days and days. How can you bury this many bodies? If you take the War of 1812, take all American casualties during the War of 1812, add to that all American casualties during the Mexican-American War, and add to that all American casualties of the Spanish-American War. Okay, you get the total here from these 3 wars. Double that 2 times, times 2. That approximately equals the number of casualties inflicted in this 1 day on Americans. I mean, we're talking bloodshed on a grand scale here. I mean, that's hard to imagine, isn't it? 3 wars, double the number of casualties for 3 entire wars, and 1 day, the number of casualties were roughly equaled that number. So Antietam was certainly the worst day, but if you look at Gettysburg, if you look at all the famous battles, the bloodshed was immense. Now, what can we say about this? I mean, how do you deal with this? Certainly part of the reason for this was the advance in warfare. It was the so-called First Modern War. Weaponry had significantly advanced. We've seen these movies of Civil War, these old Civil War movies where they have these lines, Confederate or Yankee charging the entrenched position of the enemy and getting mowed down as they go. And you wonder, well, why would they do this? Well, there were certain theories of warfare that came from the Napoleonic period, and then men who had served in the Mexican-American War, like Lee and Grant and so forth, had certain concepts of warfare. But the concept of warfare they had was essentially an older concept before the breech-loading muskets, or breech-loading rifles, became popular. What these people did not understand was if you have muskets of the old type I talked about before, you could do this sort of rush. Remember I talked about the British soldiers with the bayonet? And you could hit the fortified lines because essentially the opposition would be able to get off only 1 volley before you got to the entrenched position. You see what I'm saying here? And the accuracy was not very good. These muskets were accurate maybe to, if you were lucky, maybe 80 yards. So you could get quite close before you were in real danger. So you could line up, say, within 80 yards. You could make your 1 charge. They'd get 1 shot off, and you'd be in the trenches. You'd be fighting. So you're going to take some losses, but not of this magnitude. Okay, what happened in the meantime? You have the adoption of the rifle and a much quicker loading form of rifle. What this means is you've now got a weapon that's accurate, say, 200 to 300 yards at least. That means your troops are going to have to start their attack many times further back than previously. The weapons themselves can be loaded much quicker and they're more accurate. What does that mean? It means you're not going to get one volley, you're going to get 3, 4, 5 volleys before your line hits theirs line. It's amazing, and it's mystified historians, why it took both sides so long to realize that the strategy they had used in past warfare would not work with this new type of weaponry. And it's really kind of a mystery. At the end of the war, they kind of realized you just don't attack these entrenched positions. But this went on for years, really a couple of years in the war on both sides, and thousands of men were massacred. They were just mowed down because they were still in this way of thinking that you can reach the lines and overtake the trenches. And this thinking even persists into the First World War to a certain extent. Some of these people, all they did was maybe march up the step of attack, because you went in a certain rate of attack. You marched in the lines, essentially. But that gives you a rough idea in terms of the technology. But I want to close out the Civil War material and also the session by going back to an issue I raised before, and this is the issue of guerrilla warfare, and also touch again on some of the bloody aspects of this war. Those of you who are not from America and haven't been in American classrooms may not have heard of a man called William Sherman, but you should. He was one of the great generals of the Union. William Sherman, towards the end of the war, had an idea that he could march down to Georgia, and then without particularly pursuing the Confederate Army, could simply cut a swath through the countryside on the march to the Carolinas, South Carolina. There was the idea particularly that South Carolina should be made to suffer, because South Carolina was the first state to secede. He managed to get down to Georgia. He evacuated the entire city. He didn't want to have to leave any garrison behind to protect it. Terrible hardships were caused. The city was essentially burned as he left. They were claiming to burn only the military portions of it, but how do you contain a fire in 19th century America? He was famous for such statements as, and by the way, he's not a monster in the ordinary sense of the term. He just had a very realistic view of war. He's like a modern fighter, so to speak. He said such thing as, when he was accused of inhumanity for the evacuation of Atlanta and the burning of the city, he said, quote, "War is cruelty and you cannot refine it," close quote. He went on to say, we are not only fighting hostile armies, but a hostile people. He described the Confederate cause as, quote, "a people's war." And he said, if you're going to fight this type of war, then you have to fight it by destroying everything. Don't leave them any base of supply. He said, we cannot change the hearts of these people of the South, but we can make war so terrible and make them so sick of war that generations would pass away before they would again appeal to it, close quote. Now here you have the emergence of the modern idea of warfare. Now this is significant because this is a very distinct turning point away from that 18th century ideal of civilized warfare. It was not always upheld, but at least it was an ideal. This is an explicit repudiation of the 18th century concept of leaving civilians out of it as much as you can. He's saying you ravage everything. After he was in Atlanta, he took 62,000 troops, and he cut a 50-mile swath, as I said, 50 miles wide, destroying everything in its path, and what he called smashing things to the sea. That was his phrase. He was going to smash everything to the sea. The Southerners, so those of you from the South, this is still remembered very well in the South. A lot of Southerners have relatives that were associated with this. Before Sherman, now when he gets where he can march into South Carolina, they really wanted to mess over, particularly Charleston. But South Carolina as a whole was to be punished. Before Sherman got into South Carolina, the Chief of Staff of the American Army, Halleck, wired him with the following message, quote, "Should you capture Charleston, I hope that by some accident the place may be destroyed. And if a little salt should be sown upon its site, it may prevent the growth of future crops of nullification and secession," close quote. There was a private who was pillaging, who was stealing. They didn't distinguish between military and civilian here. A pillaging private. Now imagine this. He's probably from some small town in the north, and suddenly he can take anything he wants, right? He apparently is stopped by a woman who's saying, "Why are you stealing my things? Why are you burning my home?" His answer was, quote, "Here is where the treason began, and here by God is where it shall end." Now, I can't believe that this soldier cared that much about treason, but this became the rationale. By the time Sherman was done, he left behind him total devastation of reaching approximately 425 miles. This was the way that these rebels would be taught a lesson. And this was the emergence of a modern concept of war that was to be with America up to the present day. Not only Sherman, but others as well. Now, all I can say about this is 620,000 people died, Americans died in this war approximately, and for what? What did they fight for? What did they die for? Was it to abolish slavery? When Sherman's army went by these plantations, they picked up a lot of slaves who wanted to follow them, didn't want to be left in the South, especially with nothing there to support them. They picked up approximately 5,000 stragglers, slaves with their families and their goods on the way. In many cases, they would even burn the bridges before the slaves could get to them. In one case, several hundred ex-slaves died trying to cross the water after the Union soldiers had burned the bridge. Out of approximately 5,000 slaves that were trailing along after Sherman's army, only 700 made it to the Carolinas with the army. A lot of them died. Some of them just dropped out, couldn't keep up. You know, is this a war of liberation? After the Emancipation Proclamation, there was a lot of grumbling in the army. As it was said in those days, we aren't going to fight to free the niggers. We'll fight to save the Union, but not fight to free the black man. As soon as, when William Lloyd Garrison published The Liberator, he said explicitly, he said, there's more racism and more opposition to the abolition of slavery in the North, and particularly in Massachusetts and New England, than there is in the South. And so I'm trying to give you this to balance the picture. It was not that the North was anti-slavery, pro-black, and the South was pro-slavery, anti-black. It's not that simple. Most everyone, with the exception of some abolitionists, favored the institution of slavery, and many of those who opposed it were nevertheless very racist in their views. And then we get into the whole issue of Reconstruction. But again, to finish this, I just have to say, what was the war fought for? On the terms on which Lincoln laid it down, it was fought to preserve the Union. Suppose the North had seceded. Suppose there had been conflict. I can't convince myself that 620,000 people would have died. I just can't believe it. So anyway, I don't know what your view of the Civil War is, but to me it's one of the great tragedies in American history. As I'll be discussing in the final lecture, it leads to a good deal of the growth of the national sentiment, the battle hymn of the Republic, that sort of thing, and also to the growth of it's the real takeoff point to the growth of the federal government. Okay, thank you. See you after lunch.